Thank you, Madam Deputy President. This government's approach to education funding is certainly yet another example of their chaotic, divided and out-of-touch approach. And fairness, it certainly is not. This isn't some political argument removed from the lives of Australians. In fact, it's about a fundamental issue, the education of our children and who gets access to a decent, fair and equitable education system. Yet again, the Turnbull Government is selling Australians short, and they're doing it to our kids and young people. Madam Deputy President, in the Northern Territory, this attack on education in a way is about shattering the hopes and dreams of the education of our young people, and it's actually starting to erode any thoughts of what our future will look like in a positive way. How can Mr Turnbull's policy be needs-based when the nation's most disadvantaged school systems, our schools in the Northern Territory, get the least help? We just want a fair deal for our kids, but fairness is not what we're receiving. Instead of supporting Territory schools and students, the Prime Minister is punishing them. And the government's own Senator Back has said this morning that he will cross the floor and vote against these changes. $22 billion in cuts to schools across the country. These are real cuts that will impact the standard and delivery of education in our schools, that directly affect our children. To talk about needs-based funding is almost laughable if there wasn't such serious consequences. And if you want to talk about need, let's continue to look at the schools in need in the Northern Territory. Every government school in the Northern Territory will lose money under the model put forward by the Turnbull Government. 151 government schools across the Northern Territory will lose funding. The Commonwealth's funding proposal will see federal funds cut to 20% of the school resourcing standard. Currently, NT government schools receive 23% of the SRS. Under the Turnbull Schools policy, all 151 government schools across the Northern Territory will lose funding because they have been classified as overfunded. The Coalition must be the only people in Australia who think Northern Territory public schools, on average the nation's most disadvantaged, are overfunded. I certainly visit a lot of our schools across the Northern Territory, and I know the great work of teachers and principals and the students, and those schools deserve proper funding. More than 40% of students in Northern Territory schools are Indigenous. We heard here in February the 2017 Closing the Gap report. It shows that none of the 8 literacy and numeracy targets are on track. The gap will never close without adequate schools funding. So I ask again, how can this policy be needs-based when the nation's most disadvantaged school systems, in particular our schools in the Northern Territory, get the least help? Cutting the funding to the most disadvantaged, the schools and students with the most need, is definitely not fair. It is not just, and it is certainly not reasonable. It's such a bad idea, Madam Deputy President, that even members of the Turnbull Government are sceptical of supporting it. The Senator for WA is prepared to cross the floor against it. But this isn't the only cut this government is inflicting on education in the Territory. Federal disability funding to public schools in the Northern Territory will be cut by $10 million next year. $10 million. Commonwealth funding for students with disability loading by state show the NT's take of $27 million in 2017 will be cut by more than a third to $17 million in 2018. The more vulnerable you are, Madam Deputy President, the more education funding the Turnbull Government will take away from you. That's the message being given to the people of the Northern Territory. This government is about giving tax cuts to big business while making school children pay. Investing in schools is smart. What this government is doing is totally the opposite.